Now we're going to be going over the section of using HTML helpers, and first we'll kick it off with an introduction to HTML helpers. First off, a view, which is one of the most common points to use in MVC, is most important to all users. Here you have the control over HTML, but that can also be a little tedious. You can use lots of code nuggets to integrate data. This is simpler than classic ASP, but still it's no fun. Sometimes it's a lot easier just to drop in a control, and also you need a middle ground somewhere, and this is it in MVC. Well, there's HTML helpers to the rescue. So first we can get rescued by emitting the markup for common HTML elements, and also the view is a lightweight form of a server control. You can actually have partial views and full index views. The best example is that a full view pulls in a layout page, which is the web forms equivalent of a master page, and is fully functional throughout. So it is like a complete A to Z page. A partial view is much like a old control, like out of web forms, where say for instance you have an address control that has address 1 to city state zip. Here in MVC, that would actually be wrapped up in a partial view, so you can reuse it over and over again. Now, HTML helpers are also optional to use. You can use standard input tags if you want, or so forth, but it does help out in writing and being consistent within your application. And you can also mix and match the HTML helpers with the HTML. So next we're going to talk about our HTML helpers class. Our HTML helpers are implemented in the, you got it, HTML helper class. Here we have views and partial views that expose the HTML property. Helpers aren't native methods of the HTML helper. Instead, they are implemented as extension methods. Also to note, HTML helper is an anchor point for most of the extensions. Here are some helpful native methods. Here we have anti-forgery token, which this little guy gets plucked into any forms like you imagine, like a registration form or a login form. So this gets plopped into the view within the form, and then on the server side you actually have an attribute that is looking for the anti-forgery token to make sure whoever's posting the data is actually on your website using your view. This is to avoid some web attacks from people creating the same form on different servers trying to hack away at your system. So this is part of the defense of MVC4. By itself it's not the best, but it definitely gets you that 80% rule that I mentioned before. Other native methods that are very helpful are the attribute encode, enable client validation, encode, and then HTTP method override. Also, you can always build your own. If you don't like any of these out of the box, or they don't do exactly what you want to do, you can create your own, and then you can even replace the built-in helpers if you have something better. Here we're going to be looking at types of HTML helper methods. There are three broad classes of HTML helpers. The first of which is untyped or regular helper methods. The next are strongly typed helper methods. And lastly, they're templated helper methods. So let's look at the first type, which are untyped / regular helper methods. These guys first appeared in MVC1, and they generally take a string property name. Here's an example. Here we have two div elements, one with a class of editor-label, and the second with a class of editor-field. As you notice, within the first div, we have HTML.label, and then we're simply passing a string. What will happen is this will render out as a HTML label element with the ID of name. Within the second div class, we have a HTML.textbox, which is also passing in the name. So what will happen is this will create an HTML input field with the ID of name. And lastly, we have a HTML.validation message for name. So what that will do is that if the input field of name throws an error, it will kick off that validation message for the same property name. The second in our list of helper methods that we're looking at are strongly typed helper methods. All these have the for appended to the name of the method. These usually take a lambda expression parameter, and they also compile support for better quality code. Here's an example. We have our two div elements, and first of which we have html.label4, and then we're passing in our lambda expression within the parentheses. The second div class, we have a text box for, and again passing in our lambda expression, and lastly we have our validation message for, passing in yet again another lambda expression. The last of the three types of helper methods that we're looking at are templated helper methods. These are built in and use custom templates. They help find control over HTML. They can even throw an entire model at a helper to render all of its properties. Also, it reverts to a text box for any data types without a template. So basically, if it can't figure out what type of template to use with a particular field of a model coming across, it just throws in a text box if it can't figure it out. Here's an example of using an editor for model, which would actually generate all the properties being passed to that page. Where here you can have one line and say, create all the data types and their labels for me. I don't care. I don't need granular control. And that's all you have to do. And that's it for all the properties, and it's way more than just the name. When you're using view and model data, there are some things you want to take into consideration. One of which is most helpers actually have multiple overloads. Some of these have searches within the model state, view data, and the view model in that particular order. If a model state indicates an error, it will add input validation-error CSS class to the particular element. That is contained within the site.css by default, and here's a look at that particular class. And here's an example of that. In the example, we show that name and age among the other fields have not been filled in, so that this automatically kicks off the validation message, like name is required, gender is required, and so forth. And if you notice down on the drop down at the very bottom of the example, it actually does a different type of highlighting than what you see in the text boxes above. First thing we need to do is learn about many uses of the helpers. Most of which of these are form and input field helpers. These are very common. These can mix and match with the HTML, so you could actually have some standard HTML like input forms if you needed to, that can be right up against using HTML.label, if you will. The first thing you should look at are the strongly typed helpers before you venture on to some of the more custom ones and so forth. Input element helpers are like checkbox, drop-down list, hidden, label, list box, radio button, text area, text box, and so forth. There are three methods related to this and for validation. First is validate, validate message, and validate summary. The next area we're going to look at are template or helper methods. These were first introduced in MVC 2. These define HTML for both edit and display of data types. These are built-in types like date, time, and string. You can also create your own custom objects if you have such a need in your web application. All of these use reflection to find their properties and types. Some of the most common templated helpers are display, display for, or display for model. These generally will render out as labels and read-only values, if you will. You will not see a text box, but you actually just see the value when you do a display or display for. The editing version of this, or create version, if you will, is editor, editor for, and editor for model. And again, just to reiterate, when you have display for model or editor for model, that is like a one-line call that will generate a field and a label for every entity coming across the model that's being provided to the page. Next we're going to look at some complex helper methods. These guys go well beyond the rendering of any single HTML elements. These act more like web form server controls, or like a partial view in MVC. And of course, these are built using the wonderful jQuery. When it comes down to creating custom helpers, these always have decent support for HTML elements in the HTML helper class. But this doesn't mean you need to start handling all the HTML elements that you want to code. Built-in helpers are reasonably flexible, but may not completely work for you. Here you can write your own custom helpers, and the best way to learn is to explore the MVC source code if you're looking to write your own custom helpers. In using HTML helpers, the first one we're going to look at is the HTML.begin form. The HTML.begin form method does the work of both rendering the opening and closing tags while building the form's postback URL. By default, the page postback is the same URL that it was originally loaded from, and therefore to the same action method of the controller. But the begin form has a number of overloads that lets you specify a controller, action, and routing information, giving you plenty of flexibility in how and where the page posts. You can even specify the method used to process the form, either by get or post. The begin form takes advantage of the fact that the method creates an instance of the MVC form class rather than emitting HTML directly. This class has a dispose method that emits the closing form tag, so you can use the helper method in using a block like the following code. Here we have the create view page within our dog app sample. Here we have using HTML.begin form to start our form. And at the end we have a curly brace that marks the closing of our form. So when this renders out, this actually will generate the HTML form tags for setting up the initial form tag up here. And then where the closing curly brace is, it would have a closing form tag. When it reaches the end of the using block, right here on this curly brace, this calls the dispose method of the MVC form object and renders the closing tag. The using block wraps around input elements necessary to implement the full form. And your input elements are other HTML helpers that we'll get into later, like HTML radio buttons, checkboxes, and editor fors that do render out as normal input text boxes. So now that we've looked at a little bit of code here, let's go ahead and run our application. Let's go back to our dog list, and we'll go ahead and do a create new. And let's go ahead and right click anywhere on the page and click view source, and we'll see how this came out. So if we find our form here, there's our create, and here is the equivalent of what happens with the HTML.begin form. Here you can see that it created the HTML form element. It automatically added the action of dog/create and the method of post. Now if we look back on our view page, we can see that all we did was say HTML.begin form, but we didn't specify the action or the HTTP method to do the post. So how this works is that the view belongs to a specific controller within MVC, and it posts to itself, to its own action result method. So let's go ahead and stop our debugging, and we can take a look at that real quickly. So over in our controllers, we're going to open up our dog controller that has our matching create method, and we're going to scroll down to our create here. So our first create in MVC actually is our get. This is doing the HTTP get, which is just rendering the create screen before we put any data in. And here you can see that we're passing some view data of just the handed list down to the page. This is a way you can fill up like drop-down lists and other things that the page needs, whether it's view data or view bag type of data. Here we have our HTTP post, which this actually handles the post of the page. And so when we define our form here, and don't give it any other parameters on where to post, it's assuming that it wants to post back to the create method in our dog controller. So that's where this happens, and it takes the model of the dog, and again, it's passing data back to itself and so forth. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here so we can see this in action here. So let's go ahead and run it again. I'll have to hop back to our create page here. So we'll just go ahead and create test dog, and then male, I'll give it age of 10, which would be old dog. It's a girl dog. I will say that has left hand and say this is a test dog. Okay. So I'll click create, and you notice that it stopped on our breakpoint here doing our HTTP post. Now, one thing to point out that in MVC, because we're using the attribute of HTTP post, it does say, oh, well, this action method and this action method are completely different. But if I took that out, MVC would throw an error and actually not let me compile the project at all, because it says these two are pretty much the same. So, or doing the same thing. So what we have here is we just have HTTP post that is, handling the post of the create. But it doesn't mean that your form couldn't specify a different action method that is not related to the page whatsoever, but is willing to accept the post from the create page. Okay, so we're not going to continue that. We just want to show you how that post worked there. So let's go ahead and stop our debugging. And one thing that we want to do is also talk about another thing that's kind of handy in the form element of MVC. So HTML form element only allows get and post actions in order to submit content to your web server. But there's a method called HTTP method override, which is a helper method that emits a hidden field of the X HTTP method override with a value of put, delete, or head. This override of the method attribute of the form. You can do the same thing with the HTTP header with the same name or in a query string value with a name value pair, which is valid only for a post actions. In an example I'll show you here, we're going to emit some XHTTP method overrides for put. So let me scroll down to my create, and here I have a method override of put. So this actually is going to change the form into a put. So this can come in handy when working with RESTful techniques, like if you have RESTful services like WCF or any other RESTful services that you'd like to use within your web application. So let me go ahead and uncomment this, and we will see what this does. I'm going to save it. I'll go back to our debugging here. Back to our dog list. And back to our create. And again, we're going to view the source. So if I scroll down, we should see that this added, yep, right here. So just by that one input, we added an XHTTP method override to tell the form to be a put form now, opposed to the standard post form. But the thing is here, because we were looking just to do a standard post, because we changed the form to a put type form, if we actually ran the form, it would fail because we're not set up to run a put type of form within this example.